So lastly, do kind of a bonus video talking about the Declaration of Independence with regard to a contradiction it had in the society at the time, which was obviously that of slavery, and within Thomas Jefferson's own personal life. Jefferson owned slaves, and the views that he had, unfortunately, toward race, as leaves an ugly stain on his legacy and his ideas. That being said, sometimes the only things that are brought up about the Declaration of Independence, about when you go to Independence Hall, is the only thing that come up are, well, Jefferson said all men are created equal, but also, and that we're entitled to rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but also there was slavery at the time, and he himself had slaves and had these certain views of race and other things. Here's kind of the objection, and the goal here is not just to defend Thomas Jefferson, no matter what, by any means, but to look critically and look with a view toward correct historical methodology to have an understanding of the Declaration of Independence and its uniqueness in originating from the time period in which it did, and its contributions, all the other practical issues with race and slavery notwithstanding. I think it's a mistake to believe that because slavery has existed in the world, that there has been no progress of thought over time that started moving things away from slavery and toward greater liberty, or that what was really needed was Jefferson started the seed of it, then what was really needed was a stronger and stronger U.S. government to eventually fight a civil war to bring slavery to the end by Abraham Lincoln. Of course, he quotes the Declaration of Independence somewhat ironically as well. But the objection is kind of this: Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence are hypocritical because they refer to rights, liberty, and equality before God, yet there was still slavery. Yes, that is a contradiction that historians, political philosophers, Americans have to struggle with. However, we need to understand context. We need to understand the importance of acknowledging that inconsistency. But the common way of doing that is assuming, number one, taking kind of a proud and even presumptuous mindset in the present that we have perfection, we have moral superiority of our present time, and people before us did not. And we have risen to a level of moral superiority. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case. However, there are things that they were inconsistent on that we have a moral change toward. And there are things that we're consistent on, that I'm inconsistent on, that people look back in 100 years and probably view things that we view as normal as different. Now, Jefferson was not for slavery in principle. There in Virginia, there were laws precluding the freeing of your slaves unless you went through a process with the Virginia government. Okay, now not a lot of people did it, but even to manumit your slaves, you had to go through that process. Jefferson also inherited his slaves. Now, that doesn't make it right. That doesn't mean he's not morally responsible for the position that he was in with regard to slavery and race and these views. However, there are some things that's important to understand. Jefferson, when he was very young, he and his cousin argued in the Virginia government for the ending of slavery in Virginia. However, they recognized that people were so against it at that time that it was not going to happen, that they were going to have to take a different direction. Now, unfortunately, Jefferson also has some responsibility for bringing in more of the focus on the racial element of slavery. Now, a lot of students that I teach, I notice that it seems like, I don't want to assign motive or intention or anything, but it seems like in the present time, they're more upset about racism than actual human bondage. And you can be upset about both, and slavery included both. But it almost seems that the idea of human bondage, of kidnapping and forcing somebody to work without compensation and against their will under the threat of violence, is less repugnant than doing that because of their race. And it's a both and. However, we need to recognize a kind of moral, ethical stratification. Anyway, it's important to recognize also historical method is important. That we look at the time period and we look at what is normal, the usual, and what is abnormal, the unusual. And in doing that, we try to view where do kind of unusual changes take place. It's like people bring up, well, Martin Luther said some very anti-Semitic things. Yes, and that is terrible, and he is responsible for that. Morally, he should not have said those things. That's wrong. However, if you look at the attitudes of medieval Europe at the time, anti-Semitism is the kind of norm of those societies. That's not good, but it is normal. And there is a time where Luther is saying things that are very favorable, especially relative to his time, about the Jews and what the church's relation should be to the Jew. And so that's the unusual. That should draw our attention. Same thing with Jefferson. Slavery has been the norm of all human history. In every society, every race, every people group has always had slavery. Now, some people say, well, the American slavery was the capturing of another race, and so it was a white supremacist slavery. And while that may be true, that type of slavery has always existed as well. There have always been conquerings taking over, and that does not make it right. That does not make it morally or ethically allowable. However, slavery has been a tragedy and the norm of human existence for as long as humans have been around. There has always been human bondage for all kinds of different reasons. And over time, slavery has just been normal. Now, where you start to see it become abnormal, where you start to see it become, there starts to be changes in thinking, is around this time. So this is where you're going to start to see inconsistency and contradiction. You're going to see someone like Thomas Jefferson think through this very philosophically and say, we all have natural rights. We all have rights, liberty to pursuit of happiness, right? Equality before God, equality before the law, every human being. And then that's going to meet with the contradiction of the real world in which he lived, and even in his own life. And so Jefferson argues for the end of slavery. When he's president, he signs the end of the slave trade in 1807, 1808, when it was first constitutionally allowable, which was a huge movement toward the end of slavery. Now, there was a domestic slave trade, right, later on at this time, so there is still that. However, Jefferson made a move toward ending slavery. Also, with the Northwest Ordinance, he wanted to end slavery in those regions that would become different free states. Eventually, a lot of the states later start ending slavery on their own, and then others don't. So Jefferson does have a record of moving toward freedom and moving against slavery while also maintaining slavery in other facets. And so that's where you start to see there starts to become a tension. There starts to become a breaking point where the tension was not really there before in human history because nobody thought slavery was inherently wrong. So if you start to argue that freedom is an ideal, that liberty is the right of every person, that every human being has equal dignity by virtue of that humanity before God and the law, and that we all have natural rights. If you start to talk like that, you have to find some other reason to justify slavery if you're going to have it. Brazil, other places in the world at this time, they didn't feel the need to justify slavery because no one and nothing was questioning slavery at that time. But as it starts to be questioned in the West, Western Europe, in Britain, in America, and they start to talk about these ideals of liberty and independence and freedom, that starts to contradict the reality of slavery. So unfortunately, but this does say something about the context. Unfortunately, race developed as a reason for slavery where ideology would not justify it. Meaning other places in the world at this time, they didn't need to come up with an apologetic, a defense of slavery because nobody was asking the questions that were threatening slavery. Everybody already accepted it. It was normal, it was allowable, it was morally accepted by everyone. And now in America and other places where you start to see the ideals of freedom, liberty, and independence, plus having slavery, race becomes the focus. Not all slaves were Black African slaves. However, that starts to become more of the focus is the racial element of slavery. And so the question we have to ask is not just why did slavery exist? It's important to know, but it's also important to know that unfortunately it was normal forever. Versus why did it begin to end? Really over the last 200 years. Now, there's still slavery today in many facets in different places in the world and human trafficking and all things of that nature. Libya, after the disastrous foreign policy perpetuated there, has reopened its slave trade. And that was under the foreign policy of President Obama and Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. So other places of the world, I mean, there's still slavery. However, the American ideals, Western thought, philosophy, the influence of Christianity, though Jefferson just borrows from it partially, start to eat away at slavery, plus the economics of slavery also. And then also politically, it does get brought to an end through the Civil War, but the focus of this is Jefferson. Now, Jefferson made great moves in political philosophy and in actual politics and other things toward the progress of liberty. And here's something to consider. People today seem to think courage is saying something that they are certain most people they interact with already agree with. For example, people will say, I'm against rape, I'm against slavery, and they'll tweet that and feel brave. Whereas if you were an abolitionist in 1850, you would have been about 1% of the population, and everyone would have hated you. And for saying something as simple to us today as there should be no slavery, and that those people that are held in human bondage should be treated with equal human dignity in every area of life, that would have been seen as the radical position. That would have taken real courage. So I have a hard time believing the people who rush to say something that everybody already agrees with and feel courageous about tweeting something like that are going to be the real people standing up for the rights of the oppressed, the rights of those who are mistreated, and be willing to really say things that challenge paradigms that don't allow people to be free. And so that's Jefferson. Yes, there is an internal contradiction, but that's kind of the challenge of history, is recognizing those tensions when they appear and how important that historical tension actually is, because it represents the beginning of a change that starts to develop and continues to grow even to this day.